Hello, everyone, and welcome to our third day of the HASI conference. After discussing some challenges and opportunities relating to human-animal connections, today we will hear about new and exciting methods for communication between humans and non-human animals. We will conclude this day and the conference with a session dealing with the future directions of human-animal studies, followed by a closing ecological design presentation. Professor Dan FAIRR, Vice President of Research and Development at Tel Aviv University, regrets he could not be with us today to start us off on this special day since he had some problems with his flight schedule. We will begin this exciting day with a panel presentation presenting the Interspecies Internet project. This project is a multidisciplinary global think tank to encourage the acceleration of interspecies communication with over 3,700 members, including leading sector professionals. A primary premise of the project is to link interspecies communication with artificial intelligence and machine learning methods. The Interspecies Internet's mission is to encourage, explore, and facilitate interfaces for interspecies communication and approaches for deciphering the communication of non-human animals, with the aim to positively impact species conservation, welfare, empathy, compassion, enrichment, sustainability, and understanding. It brings together a multidisciplinary group drawn from the sciences, arts, and humanities in a rich collaborative forum to advance the understanding and appreciation of the mental lives and intelligence of the diverse species with which we share our planet. Interspecies Internet is supported by Google, MIT, and the Jeremy Coller Foundation. And it's my pleasure to introduce Jeremy Coller, who will talk a little about his motivations. Jeremy also very generously co-funds the Coller Manmon Program for Animal Rights and Welfare at Tel Aviv University, who are supporting today's conference. Jeremy is the chairman and chief investment officer of Coller Capital. In 2016, he launched FAIRR. The FAIRR initiative is a collaborative investor network that raises awareness of the environmental, social, and governance risks and opportunities brought about by intensive livestock production. In just 4 years, FAIRR has become a $38 trillion hub, making it the fastest growing ESG initiative in the world. Jeremy is one of the largest investors in food tech through CPT Capital, the venture arm of his family office. Through the Jeremy Coller Foundation, he has endowed the Jeremy School of Management at Tel Aviv University with the mission of being #1 in the world at venture. We will now move to Jeremy's speech.
Hi, everyone. Let me start with a question. Would you bet against Jeff Bezos, my good friend Sir Richard Branson, or Elon Musk? All three are making huge progress in their space exploration plans. Why is this relevant for today? Well, what happens when Elon is successful in 5, 15, or 50 years, and he hosts a party for life forms from another planet who are visiting Earth? What do we humans tell those life forms when they ask us why we treat our fellow animals with such disdain? Better still, what happens when the life forms from other planets start having a convivial conversation with other animals and we have no way to engage? Back on planet Earth, there's never been a better time for us to come together to study the intersection between laws set by us humans and their impact on other animals. That's what this conference is striving to address, and we at Memnon are delighted to sponsor it. The Coller Memnon Animal Rights and Welfare Program at Tel Aviv University fosters much needed social change and developments to animal law in Israel and worldwide. whilst also nurturing Israel's next generation of animal advocates and animal law scholars. This is a world-class animal program examining issues in law coordinated by Amnon Keren, supported by my foundation, Neva and Jonathan from Memnon, and their fantastic team, Yoav and Gabby. Now to the specifics of this program, the Interspecies Internet project. Friends of mine know how focused I am on trying to answer one question. Under what conditions can we have a conversation with a fellow animal? You might laugh, but I'm inspired by Dr. Dolittle and believe the world would be a much better and kinder place if we could chat to a cow. That's partly why I also helped to fund the Interspecies Internet initiative. You should Google or watch it on TED if you're not particularly familiar with it, as it's a wonderful initiative, led by Vinton, Cerf, Neil Gershenfeld, Diana Reiss and Peter Gabriel, who are going to be speaking in some depth shortly. An analogy I used was that of the Rosetta Stone and how it unlocked the hieroglyphics and therefore the secrets of ancient Egypt. The vision for what we're striving to seek out the conversation algorithm that will unlock in ourselves a greater sense of respect for those other animals with whom we share our planet. So we no longer just see them simply as objects and possessions. When I was growing up, I always wanted to be an inventor, to have the power to manifest imagination into reality. It'll be inventors who find this algorithm. My two proudest inventions are, as founder of Coller Capital, I'm now known almost 30 years later as the godfather of private equity secondaries. And there is FAIRR, Farm Animal Investment Risk and Return. With over 38 trillion, it's become the fastest growing animal welfare investor network in the world. Today, we're calling for action for a new generation of inventors. And my words are now particularly focused on those of you minded to take up this challenge, to bridge the gap in our knowledge. Now is the moment to harness advances in the internet and artificial intelligence, which gives us at last the opportunity of unlocking the conversation algorithm that will enable us to speak with our fellow animals. Some will mock, the stupid do, so let's just ignore them. Instead, let's have a competition. Under what conditions can human inspiration and perspiration break through the barrier to unlock a universal translator? Hats off to Peter Gabriel, who was the genesis for Interspecies Internet. And everyone here has been brought together by his vision to bring the Interspecies Internet to life. Today, we're at the intersection of two revolutions, artificial intelligence and biotechnology. This could lead to a world where AI and robots will actively work and live and coexist amongst us. Bots have already developed the ability to speak with themselves in a way we humans can't understand. So what happens when they develop the ability to speak with other animals? What happens when one of Alibaba, Amazon, Facebook, or Google owns that universal translator and can decipher their wants and needs, and we can't understand it? This isn't science fiction. This is the path we're on. Robots capable of making their own decisions will be part of our society. What happens when there is a voice for the voiceless? What will the pigs, chickens, cows, and salmon say about us, humans, to these robots? Who will be defined as the virus and pest on the planet? We all know the answer, and maybe it will not take the 5 years I said at the outset for Elon to find it. Maybe we're only 5 or 15 months away. This is one chilling prediction of a potential future. Set against that background, the Interspecies Internet has highlighted the need for this wonderful community to ensure its data and research doesn't become extinct, which is why the Jeremy Coller Foundation has given the first Interspecies Internet grant to digitalize whale song. Roger Payne's groundbreaking field recordings that led to the 1972 UN conference, which agreed a 10-year global moratorium on commercial whaling. Particularly for young scientists to carry on the analysis with new AI technology, metaphorically enabling them to stand on the shoulders of the scientists who've gone before, creating a combined sense of purpose and shared ambition that we might build within our society respect and hopefully greater compassion between ourselves and other animals. With that, I'm delighted to introduce the 4 founders of this Interspecies Internet, Dr. Vinton Cerf, Vice President and Chief Internet Evangelist for Google, co-designer of the TCP/IP protocols and the architecture of the Internet. Peter Gabriel, musician and founder of Interspecies Internet, and Dr. Neil Gershenfeld, professor at MIT and director of MIT's Center for Bits and Atoms. And finally, Dr. Diana Reiss, a cognitive psychologist, marine mammal scientist, and professor and director of the Animal Behavior and Conservation Graduate Program at Hunter College, New York. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And now it's my pleasure to introduce the 4 founders of Interspecies Internet. We'll start with Peter Gabriel.
Hi there. Thank you. And thanks, Jeremy, for all your amazing support too. The internet was designed to facilitate communication, and accompanied by the mobile phone, there has never been anything that's so radically transformed our ability to communicate or how we live our lives. We want a bit of that for the Interspecies Internet, which is there to facilitate communication between minds, but in this case, both human and non-human minds. Vinton Cerf, from whom you'll hear in a moment, and Bob Kahn designed the original net to be flexible and future-proof, and we are intending to do the same with Interspecies Internet. If you ask each of us what it is, you'll probably get a different answer. This is a meeting place for minds, but it's also a meeting place for goals and dreams. We are a motley collection of scientists, philosophers, data scientists, artists, and animal lovers. We started off as a dozen or so, but after 2 conferences, we're now 3,700 participants. Many have been exploring intra and interspecies communications and connections independently, but have chosen to come together to form a loose but passionate group of explorers and enthusiasts. The internet is such an embedded part of our lives now, it's very hard to imagine it not being there. But I would argue that it's been a tool that has fundamentally changed the nature of who we are, probably both for better and for worse, but it has been a catalyst, a tool that has accelerated our own evolution. Many of us are convinced that it shouldn't be ours alone. Extraordinary things are about to happen when interspecies communication really becomes commonplace. All we have to do is light the fuse to facilitate that communication between all minds, between all species, and then we stand well back and let it happen. Our initial focus is in 2 principal directions, on interfaces and on better understanding non-human communication. Non-humans seem to be far more adept at understanding us than we have been in understanding them. And on interfaces, a lot of work is underway. Sue Savage-Rumbaugh is leading a group working on an all-species keyboard. I've been looking at some immersive technologies, brain-computer interfaces, which is again something that I think is going to radically change who we are and how we live. Jack Gallant's lab in Berkeley is showing how our thoughts can be read from brain patterns, from the brain patterns that generate them. And as non-humans learn to read our thoughts, if they haven't been doing that all the time, and we learn to read theirs, many of these communication barriers will dissolve. This brings us straight to another point. It's really important that we define our rules of engagement. Diana's mantra of choice and control is critical. All participation must be voluntary. Humanity is absurdly self-important. As soon as we invented machines, cars, rockets, and nuclear bombs, we thought we were very much the master species. The phrase used was superior to nature. Many of us now realize how arrogant and stupid that idea really is. It's painfully obvious we are always very much a part of nature and fully dependent on it. And probably the first species in the universe dumb enough to create the potential means for our own destruction. We need to remember our place is in nature, not separate from it, as indigenous peoples have always known. But there is a revolution happening in which the current dominant species on our planet is voluntarily surrendering its pragmatic and convenient blindness to the intelligence of other beings, whom we've previously viewed primarily as goods and chattels, food, shoes, handbags, and entertainment. We'd like the full involvement and endorsement of science, but are very aware that a movement that reevaluates our relationship with nature is happening, and it's happening from the ground up, whether we like it or not. Intelligent non-humans are all over YouTube. There's been a 35% rise in veganism across Europe and the USA. Stella and Bunny, the dogs, are busy communicating with buttons. Citizen science is about to hit this field big time, with lots of young people wanting better communications with non-humans, especially with their pets. This is an amazing time to be camped out on this frontier. And thanks to all of you here and all who are working in this interspecies world, you are going to permanently change the way we see, interact with, and hopefully learn to respect all living beings on Spaceship Earth. Thanks. And now I'm very pleased to be able to hand over to the man known as the godfather of the internet, Vinton Cerf.
Well, thanks very much, Peter. Hello, everyone. It would be hard to add much to what Peter's already said in terms of motivation, but let me just say that I've always been very interested in the notion of cognition and its evolutionary development. It's clear to me that non-human species, at least a significant fraction of them, have evolved cognitive capabilities. And the question is, how do we expose that, and how do we achieve our an ability to communicate either with them, human to non-human species, and for that matter, could we get non-human species to communicate with each other? I'm not an expert in this space at all. I'm just a computer guy who likes to build networks. But we think that the internet could be a potential tool to assist in this project. For one thing, many of the species that we might want to facilitate communication for are not co-located, and so the internet can solve part of that. But perhaps even more deeply, if we in fact uncover the basis for vocabulary, for example, and semantic meaning of utterances from non-human species, the sort of Rosetta Stone that Coller was talking about, then the internet might actually be used to intervene and to perform translations and things of that kind. It will have to do transductions anyway, because the interfaces that the non-human species use in order to communicate may not be simply vocal. For example, the keyboard that's been mentioned that Sue Rombach is working on. So my job and the job that Neil Gershenfeld does is kind of infrastructure development to assist the scientists, many of whom are on this call and participating in the Interspecies Internet, to actually uncover the basis of communication among these non-human species. So I'll stop there and hand over to Neil Gershenfeld, who is, characterizes himself as a plumber, but he's certainly a very talented and inspired one. So Neil, on to you.
Thanks, Vin, and I'm happy to contribute plumbing on the project. So what I'd like to do briefly is recap sort of the history of the plumbing and then give a challenge to this group for where it's heading. So in the beginning, before the Zoom era, I was running a big head-end video infrastructure, and with Peter, we started bridging, taking tools like this, but using them for animals to communicate. So that was the very first baby step before we even called it Interspecies Internet. That collaboration grew into this TED Talk, where the platform here was really the megaphone of TED that helped bring it to global attention. From there, we followed up with a really productive workshop we hosted at MIT, where many people in this community had never really thought about themselves as a community. And there was this delight in discovering shared interest and desire to work together that really led to the launch of Interspecies as a project. During the pandemic era, we then ran a successful series of video meetings, now in the Zoom era, expanding access. That grew into a project management platform, a GitLab platform, to start building infrastructure to help support the projects. That spawned now the Interspecies.io website, with Will, who joined, who's bringing order to the community. One of the things that grew out of that is then a Slack communication channel, you're welcome to join, that has really interesting groups looking at art, music, tools, ethics, AI, all of the questions you've heard about alluded to as working meetings. And so that's where we are today. What I wanted to challenge now is, in my day job, I do a lot of work on how people talk to machines and machines talk to machines. I wanted to show you some of the tools we're using there that are a challenge to bring to this network. So one is, we spun off community labs. There's now thousands of these around the world. This is a tool to navigate them. We need something like this now for this project to navigate who's interacting with what species where, this sort of infrastructure. A second one is, this is a site we run to share open designs of machines, ways for machines to make machines, people to make machines. We need a platform like this to share tools for interspecies communication, physical interfaces for choice and control with open curated shared platforms like this. And then there's a combinatorial explosion of type of machines. This is a tool we developed to share workflows to let a machine talk to a machine or a person talk to a machine. We need a common platform like this to share the interspecies tools. So those are examples for inanimate things. We now need to build that for animate things. And with that, I'm happy to hand off to my colleague, Diana.
Well, it's a pleasure. Whoops, let me get going. Well, it's a pleasure for me to be able to talk to you all today. And thank you for this wonderful introduction to our Interspecies Internet. Well, the idea of being able to understand the communication of other species and to be able to communicate with them has been a dream for many of us. It's been a long-held dream. And the legendary tale of King Solomon's ring that gave him the power to communicate with other animals was reinterpreted by the famed ethologist Konrad Lorenz as perhaps not a power within a ring itself, but the power of listening to and observing the behavior of other animals that we share this planet with. And in doing so, we get the power to understand their own signals and in turn communicate with them. And that's what many scientists have been doing over many years. There are many scientists, past and present, who've been in search of this metaphorical ring and have made great contributions in deciphering the signals of other animals, as well as developing interfaces that, like some that Peter mentioned earlier, developing interfaces for communication or artificial codes that we can use to communicate with other species. It's that twofold approach that we're so interested in our Interspecies Internet efforts. One of the interspecies initiatives I want to mention today is to create a Hall of Fame to recognize and honor the accomplishments of these explorers. But importantly, we also want to recognize and honor the non-human participants, their non-human partners with whom they have worked. And I'm saying whom because they are who's, not what's. Towards this goal, we'll be creating photographic portraits of human and non-human team members. And notably, the Nobel laureate, Peter Badge, will be doing the photographs. We're very excited about this. We hope that this effort will serve both to honor past and present explorers and also serve to stimulate future generations in this quest. We see this effort as a way of increasing worldwide awareness and greater respect and empathy for the other species with which we share this planet. So, I'm going to stop here. And today I want to say that it's my absolute pleasure to introduce three wonderful scientists who have been exploring these areas of work, exploring deciphering the signals of other animals and developing communication codes with which they can so that they can communicate with other species. All three speakers have been active participants and contributors to our Interspecies Internet community, and it's been a pleasure to work with all three of them. After the three talks that you'll be hearing in the next minutes, we'll have a 30-minute fireside panel discussion with all the speakers you've heard so far and the speakers coming up. And that will be followed by a Q&A session so that all of you in the audience can participate in the conversation with questions and comments as well. So today, it's a pleasure for me to introduce our first speaker, Con Slovakov, who's a professor emeritus in the Department of Biological Sciences at Northern Arizona University. Con's also the founder and director of Zoolingua, Inc., which hopefully he'll have a chance to talk about. His new book, Chasing Dr. Dolittle, Learning the Language of Animals, gives you an idea of what he'll be talking about today. Con will talk about decoding animal language. It's all yours, Con.
Thank you, Diana. Let me set up my screen here. So, as Diana mentioned, I would like to talk to you about decoding animal languages. With animal languages, we have a fundamental problem, which is how do we, sorry, my screen is not working here. Okay, how do we determine if animals have languages? We have to be able to find the meaning in a communication system. And to do that, sorry, one second. To do that, we need a tool like the Rosetta Stone, which Jeremy mentioned, for decoding animal languages. The Rosetta Stone allowed us to decode hieroglyphic Egyptian, and we need a similar tool to decode animal languages. One of the ways that we can do this is by looking at the context in which different vocalizations or signaling systems occur, such as with alarm calls. For example, when a predator appears and an animal that is a prey sees the predator, the animal might vocalize an alarm call in response to that predator, and then other animals nearby take evasive action. From that context, we know that the alarm call has meaning. We can also play back the alarm call when no predator is present, and if the same behavior is elicited, then we know that the call actually has meaning. In terms of language, linguists have said that there are a number of design elements of language that we have to find in an animal communication system for it to be considered language. This was proposed initially by Hackett in 1960. Hackett had 13 design criteria or elements of language, of which 8 refer essentially to any communication system. However, there are 5 that are really important for distinguishing whether a communication system is language or not language. One of them is semantics, or the meaning of a word. Another is displacement, which is talking about things that are displaced in time or space. A third is productivity, which is creating new words. A fourth is duality, which is using phonemes to generate many words. And the last is cultural transmission, in the sense that languages are learned in whole or in part. Let's take a look at all of these different criteria one by one. In the process, I will show you examples from my work with decoding the language of prairie dogs. Let's take a look first at semantics, which is the meaning of words. With semantics, we know that many animals have this. We know about prairie dogs, vervet monkeys, Diana monkeys, chickadees, chickens, honeybees, ants. There are a number of animals that have semantics in their communication system. Let's take a look specifically at prairie dogs. Prairie dogs have alarm calls which they give when they see a predator, and these alarm calls offer us the context or the Rosetta Stone in which to define or describe the communication system. We can record the calls, we can analyze them through sonograms in which we can digitize the calls, and we can measure components of the calls, such as the different frequencies and time intervals involved in the calls. Then we can analyze those calls either statistically or through neural networks to find out whether these calls are associated with different contexts. With this situation, we've found that the alarm calls are different for different predator species. We've identified calls for a coyote, for a red-tailed hawk, for a domestic dog, and for a human. If you look at just the sonograms without any of the statistical analysis, you can see that the sonograms for different predator species are different. Here's a call for a coyote, and you can see that the harmonics involved in the alarm call are rounded, are going up, and then coming down in a round fashion. This is a call for a domestic dog. You can see that the harmonics rise steeply and then drop down in kind of a platform type shape. If you look at it in a slightly different view, such as looking at the spectrograms for a human versus a spectrogram for a dog, where we're looking at it in 3 dimensions, which is the dimension of time versus the dimension of frequency versus the dimension of amplitude of the frequencies within the call, you can see visually that there are a lot of different time, frequency, and amplitude components in a spectrogram for a human versus a spectrogram for a domestic dog. So that's the first element of semantics with prairie dogs. We've also found that prairie dogs can describe the size, shape, and color of an individual predator. Here's one experiment that we did where we actually had 4 people, only 3 of them are shown here, but these people are different in size and shape, and also they wear different colored t-shirts, where we have blue, we have yellow, orange, we have gray, and then another person was wearing a green shirt. When we did the analysis for this, we found that, first of all, you can see from the group centroids that each person differs in how the discriminant function classifies the calls for that person. Some of these differences are for size and shape. But if you look along discriminant function 1 here and collapse all of these down to this axis, you can see that we have blue, green, gray, and then yellow, orange, which also describes how the dichromatic vision of prairie dogs sees colors. We did the same experiment with domestic dogs. We used a discriminant function analysis to look at the size and shape reflected in the discriminant function dimensions. But if you look here, this is a call for a black dog, and this is a call for a white dog, and these other calls are for yellow and brown dogs. Once again, we have calls encoding size and shape and also color. And if you look specifically at one discriminant function axis versus the ratio of height to length of domestic dogs, you can see that we have an almost perfect correlation between how the discriminant function interprets the calls versus the ratio of the height to length of the domestic dogs in our experiment. We also did another experiment where we tried to assess whether the calls would code for a threatening person versus a non-threatening person. For the non-threatening person, we had a person in a white lab coat, which generally tends to obscure most of the physical features for prairie dogs. That person just walked through the colony with his hands in his pocket, walking at a slow pace. For the threatening person, we had the same person wearing a lab coat, but he was waving a shotgun microphone, which simulates a rifle, walking at the same pace as the non-threatening person. We found in the discriminant function analysis that we had a separation of calls for the non-threatening person versus the calls for the threatening person. Now, we do have to be careful here because the person was behaving differently. So it could just be that there's a difference in the behavior of the person that was reflected in the coding of the calls versus actual threat versus non-threat. In terms of productivity or coining new words, we know that prairie dogs, honeybees, and ants can do that. Here's an experiment that we did with a coyote silhouette, a black oval silhouette, and a black skunk silhouette that we randomly suspended on wires and ran them across the prairie dog colony with prairie dogs that were individually marked. So we recorded the calls of each individual prairie dog. We found that the individually marked animals all had one kind of call for the coyote silhouette, another kind of call for the skunk silhouette, and a third kind of call for the black oval, which they've never seen before. So they created a new word for black oval. Now let's take a look at duality, where words are made up of smaller structures like phonemes, and phonemes are the smallest units of sound. We know that prairie dogs, chestnut-crowned babblers, and gibbons have phonemes in their call patterns. We deconstructed the alarm calls for dogs, coyotes, and hawks, and we found out that they were made up of phonemes. Just like in human words, the same phonemes were used in different ratios for the different words. Here's a dog call deconstructed, and you can see that it is made up of some coyote phonemes, some dog phonemes, and some hawk phonemes. Let's take a look at displacement, which is displacement in either time or space. We know that prairie dogs and honeybees can do this. With prairie dogs, their alarm calls can tell about the progress and appearance of a predator over long distances, which is displacement in space. But another experiment that we did shows that they can also code for displacement in time. Here's an experiment that we did with a person wearing a blue shirt and blue jeans. This is how the prairie dogs had calls for him. Then he went out one day and shot a number of times with a shotgun in the air, and the prairie dogs changed their coding to this kind of alarm call. The amazing thing was that for the length of the experiment, an entire month, whenever he appeared, they had this kind of call for him, even though he was no longer carrying a gun. Then we have cultural transmission. We know that many songbirds, whales, dolphins, and prairie dogs have cultural transmission. We know that prairie dogs have dialects, which suggests a component of learning. Here's one study that we did with the geographical distance between colonies versus the Euclidean distance of the alarm calls between colonies. Just like with human dialects, the difference in dialects between colonies changes as a function of distance. We did another experiment in the field where we had black-tailed prairie dogs giving calls to a stuffed badger and to a model coyote. Then we compared those calls in the field with the same models in a zoo population of prairie dogs, which had been in the zoo for at least 10 generations without seeing any predators. What you can see here is that there is virtually no structure in the calls of the zoo prairie dogs for the model coyote compared to the calls of the wild prairie dogs. Similarly, for the zoo badger, there is virtually no structure here in the calls for the zoo badger by the animals that had not seen any predators for at least 10 generations versus the calls for the real badger in the wild prairie dog, which suggests that there is an element of learning in these calls. So prairie dogs have all of the design elements of language that linguists say you have to have in an animal communication system for it to be considered language. And if we look at other animals' communication systems in depth, we can find either similar properties of language or language-like properties. I explore this in great depth in my book, Chasing Dr. Dolittle, where we show that we already have a lot of information in the scientific literature showing that animals either have language or have language-like properties. So the question is, where do we go from here? I think that we need to do three things. One is we need to change our paradigm to admit the possibility that animals have language. Unfortunately, at this point, many scientists, biologists, philosophers still cling to the idea that it is impossible for animals to have language, that we humans are the only ones blessed with the capability of language, and all the poor other animals can only just communicate, usually through instinct. We need to change that paradigm and admit that other animals also have language that may be as complex as ours in some cases, may be simpler than ours in some cases, but that this language endows them the possibility to plan, think ahead, and communicate important information to each other. The second thing is we need to develop better technologies, such as AI, to decode animal languages so that we can talk to animals. And the third is we need to look at animals as sentient beings and as partners in our world instead of seeing them as disposable chattel. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Con, for such a fascinating talk. Our next speaker is Dr. Irene Pepperberg, who is an associate in the psychology department at Harvard University. And her communication studies with African gray parrots has changed how we think about the term bird-brained. Irene will be telling us about interspecies communication between humans and African gray parrots. It's all yours, Irene.
Thank you. All right, let's get the slide sharing here. Share my slides and get slideshow from beginning. Okay, so a little bit of background. I first started this work in the 1970s when people thought that, you know, the idea of animal communication, particularly avian cognition, okay, and avian communication was an oxymoron, okay, that bird brain was obviously a derogatory term, and that parrots were considered completely mindless mimics. In fact, my first grant proposal came back literally asking me what I was smoking. I mean, there was good reason for this kind of understanding in the 70s. In the 50s and 60s, Maurer had tried to establish two-way communication, a number of mimetic birds. He used the standard psychological techniques of the day, which was a simple stimulus response training. He looked at the brains as a black box. So you gave the animal some kind of stimulus, you waited for a response. If it was the one you wanted, you gave it a piece of food, and that was the deal. Well, think about the idea of training an animal to say hello when you enter the room. So the bird, for example, learns to do that. You give it a piece of food. What does the bird learn? It learns to say, feed me. Okay, that's what hello means to it. Give me some food. It doesn't mean greeting. So the bird uses it in lots of irrelevant situations. And guess what? It gets extinguished because it's not being rewarded. So for not obvious reasons, there was failure to learn. Grosslight and Zahner, a couple of decades later, around the 70s, locked a bunch of minor birds in sound isolation boxes and played them tapes of human speech. The birds learned sounds in the laboratory when they weren't in the boxes, things like squeaking doors and dripping fountains, but nothing on the tapes. Yet we knew in captivity, they learned, Polly want a cracker without any problem. So again, mindless mimics, nothing was there. However, in about 1975, Dietmar Todt, who was a research assistant professor in Freiburg, working under Otto Köhler, he had been studying bird song, but now this job required him to establish two-way communication with a gray parrot. Having experience in bird song, he thought, wait a minute, how do the baby birds learn their song? They learn it from watching and listening to the adult birds interacting. So he decided that the brain was not a black box, but rather a social information processor. And he developed this model rival or MR technique where humans demonstrated the behavior to be acquired. Well, reading that, I adapted it somewhat to what I wanted to do for my work, but essentially it's a very simple technique. One person is the model for the bird's behavior, the respondent, and the rival, okay, for the bird. The other one is the trainer. And what's critical here is the use of a referential reward, something that the bird really wants, okay? So he wants to learn how to label it so he can acquire it. I would show the object to my student. She would identify it, say it's a key. I'd say, what's this? She'd say key. She'd start scratching herself using it the way the bird would. And the bird's trying to fall off its perch looking at this. We exchange roles of model, rival, and trainer. So the bird sees one person is not always the questioner and the other the respondent. So it learns to ask questions, which is really important. I respond correctly. I get to play with the key, and I say key, and I'm playing around with it. What's also important is we sometimes make mistakes. So the bird sees that not any random new noise causes transfer of the object. I'll show a turn, she goes, rant, and I go, no, you're wrong. The bird has to see that it's only the label key that works. And it's not going to be able to say this immediately. It has to control all sorts of muscles and opening its beak up and down and the tongue back and forth like ours, using the glottis and the larynx and the syrinx and the trachea. But the point is it will start by saying something like E, and then we can shape it up to the appropriate label. So the underlying all this is how is information processed in this avian brain? It's physically smaller. That's a relative size of a songbird brain to a human. There's no sulci, there's no gyri. It looks like just a blob of protoplasm, but it's still evolutionary similar to that of primates, despite a 320 million year separation in evolution. And if you look at what we knew about bird brains in the 1970s versus what we know now, you can see again why people were considered, why birds were not considered intelligent. There was no idea that there was anything cortical at all in these birds, okay? And they were, again, mindless mimics. It only took 35 years, but people like Eric Jarvis basically did a bunch of studies showing that, guess what? Whoops, there is a cortical area. And if you look at this cortical area compared to the size of the rest of the brain, guess what? It's quite similar. And the gray areas, the gray dots are the different parrot type brains, body mass ratios, and the white ones are the primates. So you can see, okay, this is really, really comparable. In 2015, there was papers again from the Jarvis lab, along with many other people, showing that there was a particular area in the brain of parrots, in addition to the general vocal learning area, that was likely responsible for heterospecific learning. And this area might be related to other forms of learning. Another paper showed that the neural density in parrot and corvid brains is much higher than that for primates of equivalent weights. Parrots weigh about 1 pound. The density of their neurons is more likely similar to that of the great apes. Okay. Another paper showed that the science, the connections among the various areas in the brain, okay, appear homologous to those in primate brains. Even if the areas are not in the same spots, these connections are the same. And they looked at birds that is diverse as owls and pigeons. So you can see that this is conserved across all the different birds. There is some difference in what we've looked at dorsal versus ventral evolution in the areas, original pallial areas that were similar in mammals and birds. but there's so much functional overlap that these are functionally homologous. And there's parrot-specific changes in conserved regulatory sequences that are associated with genes that are linked to cognition. And they've got similar selection in human lineage, suggesting, again, some convergent evolution. Of course, none of this stuff was known when I started working on these birds in the 70s. I would give talks and people would say, well, we don't believe this. There's no cortex? And I say, well, you're the neurobiologist, go find it, which obviously they did. So over the 30 years that I worked with one particular bird, Alex, he acquired symbolic representation. He learned English labels. He learned labels for about 100 different objects, 7 colors, 5 shapes. He learned labels for categories, and he understood what categories meant, that they were hierarchical labels under which fit labels for things like colors and shapes and materials. So there was the label color, under which went blue, green, red, label for shape, under which went 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 corner, label for material, paper, wood, hide, things like that. He understood concepts of category. You could show him one object and say, what color? He'd tell you blue. What shape? 4 corner. What matter? Wood. What toy? Lock. Okay. He understood concepts of same and different, not just identity versus non-identity, but actually being able to recognize which concepts and which attributes were same and different. And I'm going to go into this in a bit more in the later part of my talk, but I want to introduce this now. He had a concept of absence of different attributes. He understood relative size, okay? And without any training, transfer the concept of absence of similarity and difference, which he had learned being able to say, we'd ask him 2 objects, he'd say, what's same or what's different? He'd say color, shape, matter, or none. He'd transfer that label none to an absence of relative size. So if you ask him what color bigger or what color smaller, and there was no difference, he said none. He had a concept of number, an exact number, concept of number. He could literally count to 8. He learned through joint attention, just the way children do. So we had to absolutely use this model arrival technique and focus with him on the object whose label he was learning. Okay, he produced new labels. Okay, so when the first time he saw an apple, okay, he didn't say apple, he called it binary, elision of banana and cherry, pieces of banana, pieces of the label banana, pieces of the label cherry, to describe something that tasted like a banana but looked like a big cherry. First time he had cake, he called it yummy bread, not having labels for this. He played with his vocalization. So he saw himself in a mirror. He asked what color. We told him he was gray. And then he learned the label gray through that. He learned the label orange by asking us the color of the carrot. And he learned the label carrot by asking us what we were eating. And he played with these labels. So once he learned gray, he produced gray, grain, chain, cane, okay, which led to a fast mapping of a sort in which if we found an object that would map to these labels, they became embedded in his repertoire. He had some level of recursion, not the Chomskyite, okay, embedded phrase recursion of this is the cat that bit the rat that ate the cheese that lived in the house that Jack built, but we could show him a tray of 7 different objects of different shapes and colors and materials, and we could ask him what object is green and 3 corner. So he had to understand recursively to go back to object to tell us what this conjunction of attributes referred to, or what shape is, 3 corner in wood, or what color is, 3 corner, what shape is blue and wood, or what color is 3 corner and material. So he understood these labels in a very complex way. And here's just a little bit of just very simple things in talking. Wanting corn, wheat, which is shredded wheat. So he understood, had phrases, I want X and want to go Y, where X and Y were appropriate object or location labels, and they were meaningful. He asked for the wheat and you gave him a banana, he'd pick up the banana and throw it. Okay, and he could also use the corner. So I'm going to be focusing a little bit on issues relating to parrot perception, cognition, and symbolic representation, where symbolic representation was critical in his ability to understand our questions and respond appropriately. Same, different, numerical concepts, relational concepts, optical illusion, conservation, and logical reasoning on probability. Some of these I'm not going to get to in this talk, but it might be able to come up in the question period. Okay, so at how people were generally studying things. So for monkeys, for pigeons, they would present, trying to understand same different, they would present some, slides like this, and it was very simple. You touch this if it were same, you touch that if it was different. You're talking about basically identity versus non-identity. Things were absolutely the same, or they had nothing in common. For Alex, same different was much more complex. He would see these two objects and he'd be asked what's same or what's different. And he'd have to respond, color, shape, matter, or none. So in this case, obviously, color is different, shape is different, and material, these would have been like pieces of paper, would be same. Okay, and he could do this even if the objects were entirely novel, all right? And if you're wondering what's going on here, they're both little plastic toys that we showed him, so they're the same matter, but different color, different shape. He'd never seen these things before. In terms of numerical concept, having symbolic representation meant that he understood exact, not approximate number. So you give him a tray like this and you say, what color 6, okay? So he has to look at this, find the 6 things on this tray and tell you the color of the object that has 6 to it, okay? And this was absolutely exact. If you asked him what color 7, he would state none, okay? He wouldn't just give you the largest number, okay, present, or the closest thing to it. He knew that there were not exactly 7 things on that tray, and he would say none. So he had comprehension as well as production. And comprehension, actually, this is important, because comprehension is difficult for young children up to about 4. You can look at, a 3.5, almost 4-year-old, you ask them, you give them 4 marbles and you say how many, and they'll go, counting 1, 2, 3, 4. There are 4 marbles. And you think, okay, my child knows 4. You give them a bowl of marbles and you say, give me 4. And they grab a handful and hand it to you. They don't truly understand what this means, okay? He also could infer the order of numbers from their meaning, not by a rote instruction, because actually for Alex, his numbers weren't taught in order. He was taught 3 and 4, then 2 and 5, and then 6 and 1, okay? So he had to infer their order, okay? Apes had to be trained, okay? Even though apes were trained their orders, the order of their numbers, not trained the labels of their numbers in order, they had to be trained, okay, to infer the ordinality. Alex inferred this. That also meant that he understood the successor function. When you learn a number line and you learn, these in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, okay, that the next number in line is exactly 1 more than the number before it. Children have to be at least 4, sometimes 5 years old before doing that. And he did this without any training. In terms of relational concepts, why are relational concepts important? Because using symbolic representation, we could ask both what color bigger and what color smaller for any novel objects. And this is important because you look at a tennis ball, okay? Well, it's not big or small. It's only big in relationship to a golf ball, and it's small in relation to a volleyball, okay, or a soccer ball. So you need to be able to understand that these relations change based on the context. And this is something we could ask, just simply asking him the way you ask a young child, which one is bigger and which one is smaller. So you can test this relative ability quite quickly. In perceptual studies, okay, you show a pigeon a set of objects like this, and you want them to know if they understand that this is just an occluded object, that there's really a blue square there. So you show them this object, and then you ask them to match to a blue square and to this funny thing with a bite taken out of it. The pigeons generally match it to the thing with the bite taken out of it, okay? Whereas we could ask another bird, Griffin, what shape blue? And he would tell you 4 corner. So he understood it was a square, If he were counting visible corners, he would have obviously said 5 because there were 5 points here. But because he understood symbolic representation, that these figures were symbols, the way his labels were symbols, he could respond appropriately. Probability studies. You look at Piagetian, probability, and there's a lot of argument as to when this actually occurs, but the underlying concept is you need to understand how ratios affect the likelihood of something happening, not simply a difference between more versus less. So studies with infants, they see a bunch of little objects bouncing around in a balloon, okay, and a cover comes down and one object drops out. And they look longer when it's the minority object, okay? So the idea is that, they understand probability because they understand it's not probable that the minority would come out, but it could be just an interest of novelty. It's more interesting that this weird little one comes out instead of the more, okay? Older children and Griffin saw the following. We had a bucket. We put 3 things of one thing, 4 things in another come in. The can is shaken and 1 is removed while hidden in the hand. And now you ask him, okay, what's the color of the missing block? In fact, we didn't do it just with colors of blocks. We did it with lots of different objects and lots of different proportions and of the different objects and reversing the proportions. And he exactly tracked the probability. We gave him 96 trials, and 23 he guessed minority and 23 he guessed majority. He couldn't know what was in our hand. And he wasn't correct very often because he was just guessing, but he guessed according to the probability. Children have to be at least 6 years old to do so, and some don't succeed until much older. Now, according to Primate, non-humans that understand the symbolic representation actually process information in ways that are different from non-humans without such a capacity. And some studies in my lab really do suggest that's true. But at the least, this symbolic representation enables us to determine the extent of their cognitive abilities to a far greater extent than you can by using any other techniques. And it's also really important to recognize that this communication system, it's so unlikely that we can instill it de novo, but it's likely based on some existent cognitive architecture. The way to instill an animal that this thing, that there's a label for a color, because there's something existent, is unlikely. So this is the end of my talk, but I think this is just the beginning of what we can learn, and there'll be time for questions afterwards. So thank you very much.
Irene, thank you for such a comprehensive summary of all this work you've done with Alex and the other birds. It's really wonderful to hear this all in one moment. Thank you. Our next and our final speaker in this particular section is Dr. David Solzer, who is interestingly both a scientist and a musician and a composer. He's a professor of neuroscience in the departments of psychiatry, neurology, and pharmacology at Columbia Medical Center, and also in the School of Arts at Columbia University. Given his work and interests, Dave will be talking about science and the arts. It's all yours, David.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for inviting me for this interesting presentation this morning over here out in Israel. Here are the questions we're going to be talking about in my 15 minutes. Do other species here sound like we do? And the answer is, you just heard from Khan. No, we don't exactly. We would not be able to easily distinguish those 100 millisecond calls that the prairie dogs gave. We don't have that ability. Nevertheless, a lot of the architecture is very similar. It's similar to what Irene was talking about. So I'm going to show you why for species with the cortex, we're similar enough so that we can start to understand these circuits. And we're going to have to do that in order to understand the communication and better communicate with other species. Otherwise, we are talking past each other. How does sound acquire meaning? I won't say very much about that. I'll show only a single slide, but there's some interesting work on that where at some point this is going to be a question that we must answer. Of course, it will be somewhat different for different species, but it looks, at least for species with a brain, that there's going to be a convergence of some of the circuitry. And finally, can we get better at interesting and reward? Well, you just heard about this from both Con and from Irene. We're very primitive, as Irene was, I think, alluding to, with some of the early work on parrots. You know, we give them food reward. The food reward may be important at times. It's similar with training children. You know, do you train them? Do you give them food to learn when they're? Does it work better when they're hungry, and so on? But these are questions we have to address. So just to get to the point, these are the conclusions. I'll show you the conclusions before I show you the discussion. So are we talking past each other? Obviously, in some cases, you just saw in Con's talk how the calls for by prairie dogs, say for a fox that are living in a community, are quite different than ones that have grown up in a zoo. To them, the acuity for high harmonics in a short call, a tenth of a second, is fine. For us, if we can hear it at all, it would take a great deal of practice and training. Just to go to the extremes, bats hear to 200,000 kilohertz, 200,000 hertz. We hear to 20,000 hertz, so they hear. A lot of their communication is happening, obviously, octaves of what we can deal with. Same may be true to some extent even for bonobos. Many of you know about Katie Payne, who discovered that elephants, to some extent, are communicating an octave lower than what we can hear. There are senses in fish, bees, and birds that we don't even have. For instance, senses of electric fish can sense magnetic fields and use them for their communication. And of course, other animals, obviously, you have pet dogs, rely much more on smell, and many others rely more on vibrations that are essentially impenetrable to us. So for the people, the technology people like Con and Vint, this is a way that you can really help. And it's not internet, I would acknowledge, nevertheless it will. It's important work. How does sound and other signals acquire and lose a meaning? Well, because in culture, like with prairie dogs, or with Irene, with Alex, these change. These simply cataloging is only going to get us so far. I've lived in New York's Chinatown for 30 years. I have not learned Chinese. Even if I had a beautiful AI system that could catalog every word, it's not going to help me a great deal, and it's only going to be a snapshot of a particular time. So that's examination of my own species and my neighbors that I do communicate with all the time. It's giving us an idea of how long the understanding about other species is going to take. Our species, for us and our students, it's for our students. This will go on for many generations. And what's rewarding? You've heard a bit about this. We have effective ways, for instance, to treat kids with retardation. And often we do this with food, but or we test fear learning and we use the scent of a fox or something like this. This is another way the technologists can help us. We really not only need to be better at what the signals are, we need to be better at what the behaviors are. The behaviors we're using are very primitive. It's a start, but we must get better. If we don't get better, our level of understanding of other species is always going to be extraordinarily limited. And I understand that the interspecies keyword that we've been alluding to may be helpful, but I think it's only the very beginning. So first question, do other species here sound like we do? I'm going to tell you yes, and just give you a tiny bit of physics on this. The qualities of sounds, as you saw in Con's examples of prairie dogs with evenly spaced harmonics, is really a property of physics. It's a property in nature. This was first written about by the followers of Pythagoras, shown over here, who realized that you could slice a string, actually, in this case, put your finger on a string in the midpoint, and you have half a string and half a string, and the frequency that you hear will be the reciprocal. It will be twice as high. So for musicians, this is an open guitar string. This would be the 12th fret. This would be the first octave. What musicians should know, but usually don't, is if you divide the string in thirds, you end up getting the fifth degree, the do, re, mi, fa, sol. So you'll get the sol. If you divide it in four, you'll get fa, etc. This has been known since the work by the early Greeks, and in fact, probably by the Egyptians even before that. But these are properties of strings. This is how you figure out where to put your finger on a string. And you can hear a harmonic if you don't, for the musicians, if you don't completely push down on the string. But this happens all the time, even when you pluck an open string, or when you play a flute or a clarinet, or any of these musical instruments, because the vibrations are not only for the length of the string or the length of the tube, they will also be formed at the half, at the third, at the quarter, and this makes a harmonic overtone series. So at least to this extent, our ideas of consonants come not really from the ear, not from the brain, but at this point from physics. Incidentally, this realization was very important to the ancient Greeks, because they said, we can describe the whole universe by very simple real number fractions, until one of his students discovered that the square root of 2 couldn't be described that way. Anyway, it's continued to have this very simple insight. It allowed Galileo to realize what noise and consonants meant. When Newton discovered the spectra of colors with the prism, he said that it was the same phenomena. And even de Broglie discovered atomic orbitals based on this discovery of slicing up the strings into smaller, even units. So for the interspecies internet and all internet, to some extent, your use of transistors and the ability to have an internet is based on these old on these old reports from Pythagoras. So how long have these sounds been constant for us? Well, this is a reconstruction by Wolf Hine of the earliest flute that's been found. It's from at least 35,000 years ago, and even 35,000 years ago, our ancestors were playing the scale. This is so old that another flute was found there with made out of a mammoth tusk. So it was the time that mammoths were running Germany. We can put these together. I'm going to do any demonstrations, but if you're interested in this, I would recommend downloading a free program called Audacity. You can experiment with it, and you could take these harmonics. This would be, say, the note C. This would be an octave higher. This would be the G above that. This would be close to the E above that. And you can add them together, and you get very nice repeated waves, which are called periodic waves. They have a period, and this sounds consonant to us. We could take other notes. This is a note. This is an interval all musicians know. It's in the 7th chord. It's called a tritone. And you can see that the periodicity becomes much less. And you can go to detuning a bit. And now we're starting to see a lack of periodicity. And eventually this leads to noise. That was what Galileo reported 500 years ago. So how do we perceive and analyze and recognize these patterns? This is an experiment from Mark Tremo, who used to be at Harvard, now is at UCLA. He's recording from the auditory nerve of a cat. So this is the nerve that runs from the hair cells of the ear up into the brain. And you could see if you just play this perfect fifth, which would be a note and 1/3 of the length. that you get these periodic intervals. So this happens in us mammals, even in the rhythms of the neurons firing, which are perceiving the sound waves as they come into our ear. Now, as we get less and essentially more noisy, more dissonant, as in this minor second over here, you can see that again, there's less of this regularity. There's still regularity, but as we get noisier and noisier still, now that you know what the definition of noise is, we're going to see less and less periodicity. Does this happen in people? This was discovered by Wilder Penfield up in Montreal from starting in the 1930s, doing this sort of surgery. This is a fellow with intractable epilepsy. Here's Penfield over here. I believe that perhaps this is Brenda Milner here. This is Herb Jasper, who's doing the EEG simultaneously on the patient. The patient is awake during these surgeries. These surgeries are still done. And this was the discovery of how the cortex, which you just saw in Irene's papers, has different regions. So if the surgeons would stimulate over here, but on this area of the somatic cortex, you would feel a response in whatever part of the body it would respond to. So the index finger is going to be somewhere around here. You stimulate the cells over here, you're going to feel something. Now on this other side, the motor cortex, if you stimulate during one of these operations, you're going to move the finger, whether you want to or not. The auditory cortex was found to be over here. There's also another area over here that he called the interpretive cortex, where memories, especially auditory memories, often false memories actually, can be evoked in the operating room. And as this is going on, again, the patients are awake and can report, I'm hearing music or whatever. This is how the operation is still done for people who have intractable epilepsy. Now it's done with a multi-electrode unit. And this is work from Nima Meskarani, who's at Columbia University. And we can go, because essentially it's the same approach, it's just that there's more electrodes. So this is the auditory cortex over here. And you can play a short sentence like, and what eyes they were, and you can find out which parts of the auditory cortex react to which phonemes. In fact, this is so reproducible in an individual that you can tell what they are hearing. You can reconstruct what they've heard from these patterns, which eventually will help with treating certain forms of deafness. Here's another one. This is phonemes, that, again, from the Meskarani lab, spoken, and the similar kind of experiment. This is not in a human, this is in a ferret. Now, ferrets obviously did not evolve to understand our phonemes, and yet they have the ability, and also you can reconstruct what the ferret heard. In fact, from this area, you can reconstruct the phonemes. From other areas, you can, for instance, subtract the pitch. So this is an argument that, at least for auditory cortex, although the ear is different and the bats can hear to 2,000 hertz and the elephant to 10,000 hertz, et cetera, that a lot of how hearing works is going to converge. So I'm going to really only show a single slide on this. It's something my lab and other laboratories are very interested in. But just mostly for the sake of time, how does sound acquire a meaning? This is something we're going to have to get into. We don't have to do it in every species. Maybe we only have to do it in human, but we do have to understand. Otherwise, we will not understand how words, music, etc., smells, how they acquire meaning and how that meaning changes in culture and experience. I'll just say that the auditory cortex and the auditory thalamus, which I haven't mentioned yet, but it's on the way to the auditory cortex, both have convergent outputs to a particular area. This used to be called the auditory striatum. And also innervating the striatum are these neurotransmitters you've heard of, dopamine, serotonin. The convergence of these and the timing of these becomes very important, and we can reconstruct for very simple learning. Things like there's some sugar water over there. I will press the lever and go over and acquire the lever. We can reconstruct the synaptic physiology required to do that. So I'll just, that's a long series of information itself. But we do have an idea of the location. We also have an idea of the rules of the circuit. It's not a binary circuit. It's not the way that computer people think about it. It's going to require, if you will, frequency modulation. Okay, let's go to the final topic, which is, can we get better reward and something interesting? And here's where my side title, Science and Art, actually makes sense. We are very primitive at the sort of rewards that we're giving to animals. In some cases, I'm going to say science and art might be more similar than we're considering right now. Here's you've been hearing about birds learning song a little bit from Irene. She's working with great parrots. This is work by Ofer Chinovsky, who happens to work in the same institution with Diana, based on research from Fernando Nottebohm. And Ofer was wondering, how do we, well, a zebrafinch in this case, worked to hear his own father's song while this period where they're trying to learn song. And here's a little video of it. You'll see a tail display over here. So you see the tail fan out as the animal, as the bird has triggered his father's song. Now, with a couple of other people who said, oh, this is cute. Can we do this with, will they also press to hear other bird songs? Will they press to hear human music? Actually, we asked that after we heard it. And they will. And they'll do this hundreds of times a day. Granted, these are, quote, domesticated, if you will, but caged birds. And they're bored. But they will trigger, for no food reward, they will trigger, the only reward being hearing it back. Here's 4 zebra finches. Triggering trumpets and trombones. Again, they will do this, and it's circadian. They'll do it in certain times of day. It's also cultural. It changes. There'll be times when they do a heck of a lot of it. They get very excited. Other times they'll ignore it. You have to introduce new sounds. Just play a few seconds of birds triggering gamelan. There's some kinds of human music they'll play hundreds of times. Others they will play once and then they'll move on. This is something we'd like to pursue. So for people out there who are students who would like to work on this, we're actually actively looking for people who might be interested in this. There are a lot of questions. Will wild birds do it? If we design something that's ergonomic, can we measure learning, changing tastes, to the cultural changes we've been talking about? And eventually, and again, where people like Neil and Vin can help on this, routines to allow the birds to eventually program their own sound. No, language, I don't know if this is language. I'm not going to go out on a limb with that. But it's communication, or it's art, or whatever it is. But it's something that, it's a thing that other animals would like to do as well. If you are interested, contact us. Diana and Khan and I have been talking about how to extend this work. And we just kind of need zebra finches at home. How much time do I have, Diana?
You're fine. Keep going. You're good.
Okay, a little bit more on the elephant, on elephants playing music. These are, many of you are aware of the elephant painting. It was all, it all comes out of the Forest Industry Organization, which is a branch of the Thai government in northern Thailand. Many of you are Israeli, so many of you have actually been there. When you go to the Thai Elephant Conservation Center, the first conservation center for elephants, and still the only public one, the other ones are private. Most of the people that come in are Thai or Chinese. Most of the money is made from Chinese tourists, but there are a lot of Israelis that show up after their stint in the army. This was mostly due to an elephant conservationist, Richard Lair. And one thing, I'll mention this at the very end again, it's time to get somebody who's committed to interview Richard on the whole history of this, because when he's no longer around, this history will be gone. But at any rate, with a couple of New York artists, Coller and Melamy, The elephants were taught to paint. This only takes them a few minutes. It's actually kind of a cottage industry now throughout Thailand to sell elephant paintings. This is the picture of the conservation center. It's a teak forest in Thailand. We've built over 40 instruments, we meaning Richard Blair, myself, and the Mahouts that work with the elephants. They've recorded 3 CDs. Here are some of the instruments. The drums, not a surprise. Tuned instruments might be more of a surprise. For instance, these are tuned tubular bells, and they play xylophones, and these are traditional instruments called angaloons. And just a little bit of the music, and the music is improvised. The only thing, so you see 2 humans here playing rain sticks. These were one of the few instruments that we couldn't get, we built that we just couldn't get elephants to play. It's not very ergonomic for them. But as you see over here, here are elephants playing these tuned bells. Now, right now, he's telling them to stop. Now, he's pulling on the ear, says start. But often you don't need to do this. They will sometimes play spontaneously. They enjoy this. And they're improvised musical pieces. And just show a few more seconds of this. This is all live, unedited, and that it's real time. But obviously we're using more than one camera. All right, so for instance, there's Luke Cope. This is Maycott. Maycott here wasn't told to do that, and the Mahout is trying to grab the hammer out of her trunk, which is hard to do with a 10,000-pound animal. Because of I'll just mention very briefly, this is important stuff for this meeting. There's a crisis for Asian domesticated elephants. To read about it, Richard's article here from last year, but essentially there were 100,000 domesticated elephants in Thailand around 1900. The population is now under 4,000. Most of them in private hands. They've lost their work. They are mostly working now in tourism, including over 100 private camps, mostly to make money, which has always been our relationship with elephants. And this is not necessarily a problem in itself, but it can become a problem, as it has been right now, because during the pandemic, the Chinese visitors, which make the bulk of the money, have not been able to visit. We're going to have to be smarter about how to approach this sort of thing. Succinctly, there is not a possibility of returning these elephants to the wild, even though they're a much smaller population than they were 100 years ago. We should expand this to other animals, of course, whales. These are dolphins, whales that Diana works with, gibbons, howlers, but starting off with songbirds. So those animals which make sound of their own volition are also, I think, the ones which would be most likely to play on musical instruments. So finally, there are conclusions. We need more relevant sensory inputs, not just simply 10 kilohertz sine waves, which is okay for humans. We're used to hearing that kind of junk on the radio, but has really no relevance to other species and animals. We need better behaviors. We need so-called, what psychologists call operant behaviors, the animals interacting with each other in the environment, not just us saying, here's some fox urine, here's some food, do what we tell you to do. Irene was saying how that can lead us to very, very shallow interpretations. And we really need better understanding of what matters to other species. And I hope you've seen some examples, which I hope startle you in a way. Human music can be a reward for songbirds. Is that a form of communication between us and the zebrafinch? I would say that in some ways that's the start of the ability to perhaps go a little bit deeper and learn what's interesting and important to them. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Diana, and thank you for listening.
David, thank you so much for those amazing perspectives. It really gave us so much to think about, and it's a whole other way of thinking about animal communication. Anat, I'll turn this back to you.
Yeah, thank you. So thank you again for the stimulating presentations. And we will now move to the fireside panel with the Interspecies Internet Board and the speakers, moderated by Dr. Diana Reiss. You're invited to write any questions and comments you have in the Q&A button, and my colleague, Dr. Daphna Shir-Vertesh, will return to them in the Q&A section. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. So I have a couple of questions I thought I would just throw out for our group before the Q&A starts. So often the best work generates new questions. Given some of the things that we've learned about animals, what are some of the new questions we're thinking about now?
Are you looking for just anyone to jump in?
Anybody, just raise your hand, Vin.
Well, yep. Look, these were fabulous presentations, and for me, they generated a particular desire to help animals exhibit agency and intent. I think that a lot of cognitive behavior arises exactly out of the ability to communicate intent or to execute agency. I remember visiting Coco the gorilla, and I was told by Penny that Coco wanted me to come into the cage and play chase, except Coco weighs 400 pounds and I don't, and so I decided I would try something else. And so then when I didn't respond to the chase invitation, which was, it felt very real. In other words, Coco was looking at me and signing, and I felt like this was a very deliberate thing. So we ended up, she wanted me to get a blade of grass and put it in between my thumbs and make a sound, which I eventually figured out how to do, and she was happy with that. But
form of musical communication then.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah, exactly right. Although, believe me, my talents were quite weak in the, if you ask me.
You're good on a blade of grass.
Yeah, well, you know, I'm waiting for the orchestra to ask me to come and play the blade of grass. That'd be great. Better than the paper cone kazoo. But I wanted to pulse the others who are in this conversation about this notion of permitting animals to express agency and execute exhibited agency and exhibit intent. I think we can go a long ways towards achieving that objective with the right kinds of tools, and possibly with the help of software and maybe even machine learning mechanisms that we can run in the internet. So I'm just wondering whether the others are feeling the same sense of almost urgency to show the general public that animals have this cognitive capability, and that we should not forget that. In fact, we should actually celebrate that.
Anyway, Irene?
I mean, this is one of the things that we've really tried to emphasize in our work. The fact that, you know, our parrots are not little automatons that we just, you know, what color, what shape, and that's it. But that they ask us questions, you know, that new things come into the lab and they ask us, what color, what's that? Okay, they are requesting this information. Okay, they're interested in interacting with us. And this is something that we've really tried to push. Also, as you also probably know, gray parrots are incredibly endangered now, CITES 1, you know, levels. And people tend to want to conserve that which is similar to them. So when you show them these birds interacting the way young children interact, all of a sudden people start to think more about the need to, you know, save their habitat. And of course, when you save their habitat, it's the same habitat as, you know, so many numerous other creatures in Africa. So yeah, these are really incredibly important issues that, you know, we've been trying to deal with. But again, we have, you know, we're hoping that this interspecies internet gives a wider, you know, chance to get people excited about this and to get a wider audience. I mean, that's, you know, one of the real things that we're so excited about.
Thank you, Irene. Khan? Yes, Khan.
I can just second what Irene was saying, that people shoot prairie dogs, they poison prairie dogs, they think that prairie dogs are pests. But when I tell the general public that prairie dogs can talk to each other, they start to empathize with these creatures and start saying, maybe we really shouldn't be poisoning them. Maybe we really should be thinking about them as sentient creatures. And so I think that it is very important to find keys that allow the general public to empathize with animals, which unfortunately a lot of people don't think of animals at all. They don't empathize with them. Animals are just sort of in the way. They're often nuisances. But if we can find ways to have people empathize with animals more by showing all of these different amazing things, the cognitive things that animals are capable of, I think that we'll go a long way towards having people have a better relationship with animals and give them more agency.
Thank you. Neil.
Yeah, we're using internet in maybe 3 different senses. I'd like to separate. So one is we're using it as a stand-in for state-of-the-art computing. So AI to translate, which is valuable. A second is we're using it as a means to communicate the compelling work we saw this morning to more people. But there's a third sense we haven't talked about, which is Metcalfe's law. There's a question about the exponent, but a rough version of it is the value of the internet goes as not the number of nodes, but the square of the number of nodes, because that's the number of nodes that can communicate. And there's various ways to measure that. And so the analogy here would be beyond interspecies as a pairwise thing. If communication is happening in a network, sort of the heart of the value of the internet is the value goes up faster than the number of participants. The group can do more than the participants individually. And listening to the talks, I was struck a really interesting kind of threshold task would be to show animals mediated through interspecies internet communication can solve tasks beyond what they could do without it, that the value goes up faster than the number of animals, I think would be a really compelling demonstration to try to shoot for.
I think that's amazing thought, Neil. You know, one of the things I'm agreeing with everybody, what everybody's saying, and I think that one of the things that we've all really cherished about this is that we can link minds. We can link our human minds in finding creative ways to build empathy, to share our scientific information, but linking us with other non-human minds and showing these patterns that connect us. And I think that what Con and Irene were saying about empathy, I think that's a big key. It gets back into, you know, the in-group and the out-group. You know, in our own species, we tend to often think more about those who are in our group than out of our group. And now we're hopefully changing those things. And I think some of these studies will help us bring non-human animals into the in-group, making people realize that we're in a group. It's not them and us. We're in it together. I have several other questions. So what technologies or approaches do you guys see as having particular value here? And I'm going to couple that with another question, which is, what do you see as the major challenges that we have in making a breakthrough? So it may be coupled with technology, but what do you think are the major challenges that we face in interfaces or deciphering? Vin?
I keep trying to be thoughtful about muting and then I forget to unmute. Look, one of the things that's really interesting here is the dimensionality of the problem. There are so many different ways for animals, including us, to communicate, whether it's gestures or spoken communication or, you know, actions and things like that. So there's a large dimensionality, and one of the technologies which has emerged over the past 2 decades is machine learning, which allows us to work with high dimensional spaces. And so gathering substantial amounts of information about the communications of various species gives us, if we can accumulate all of that, put it in a place where we can manipulate and work with it, we may be able to discern patterns that we might not otherwise detect. And so this is the unsupervised machine learning is an example of a way to discover correlations and patterns that these large-scale machine learning multi-layer neural networks can do that even humans can't do. So that's one thing, is to accumulate as much of that data as possible in order to do the analysis. Neil was jumping in.
I was just going to add one thing to that thought, Vin. One of the interesting things emerging in machine learning is you start with these giant data sets and representations, what comes out is very complex things in behavior. But if you constrain it in between, you can force the networks to learn low-dimensional representations of high-dimensional concepts. And there's been some interesting work on that in the Interspecies project, where you, by forcing these low-dimensional representations in between the input data and output data, you start to get signals of concepts. And so one of the interesting questions here is, can you actually start to abstract the underlying concepts in the communication that way?
The inverse of that are simple rules that produce complex behavior, like Conway's game. And so that's, you're inferring what the generating functions are, essentially, of the of complex behaviors.
Right.
Anybody want to continue on that one thought? You know, one of the things I think that's most challenging, and I work with dolphins. We've done underwater keyboards, and now we have a big interactive touch screen that we can also, so we can provide choice and control to other animals, dolphins, elephants, all varieties of animals. And I think one of our challenges from the studies with chimpanzees, with sign language and with using keyboards, and when Irene's working with African gray parrots, is that tracking the behavior over time. Mm-hmm. And, you know, in the early studies in the 1960s and 70s, you know, we get reports of gestural use by chimpanzees, but to be able to get that corpus, that video of watching, you know, documenting how this has occurred and looking at the context in which it's used gives us this richness. And I keep hoping that we can use you know, new technologies to really, first of all, to document, but also to be able to analyze these behaviors. And I know there's some new technologies now coming out that can actually read the body language of dogs, that you can actually use this to not only track what dogs are doing, but can actually detect illness or a change in gait of a dog. I'm just really hopeful that we can start, you know, having teams created that can help us track and decipher this. And it gets back to what you're saying, Neil and Vin, of these big databases.
So here's a different thought. You know, one of the things that I remember seeing an example of was two chimpanzees cooperating with each other in order to accomplish a task, which was to get some food. And they had to work together by pulling ropes at the same time. I wonder if anyone has ever tried to take two different species and experiment to see whether or not they're capable of figuring out what cooperation means. I have no idea whether anybody's tried to do that, but think about music for a moment. Think about jazz, think about jamming. That's a kind of a cooperative activity. I wonder whether there is a musical opportunity here to take two different species and use music and musical instruments and sound production to experiment with any kind of cooperation.
We tried playing whale songs to elephants, and our technology is too poor. The elephants really don't like wearing headphones.
Well, it's also making sure that you've got the right waveforms, because their hearings, you know, you've got.
No, we're in the same. Okay. No, you're absolutely right about that, and it's a point was trying to make. To answer another point that Diana made. If we don't understand the sensory systems better, we're literally talking, these poor other creatures have to act like these idiot humans. They can't even hear up here, and they can't hear as fast as we moving boars who only care about unimportant stuff anyway. So we have to get better at understanding their senses. That's very important. It's going to take a long time to do this. This is one reason to have conservation. We need conservation. Not only because once these species are gone, they will never come back again in the history of the universe. One reason why Roger Payne's work has been so helpful in maintaining, you know, the sorts of things that we've been talking about. People now think about whales in very different ways. But in that case, we're in the right frequency range. We don't know whale frequency ranges very well, but some of them seem to be able to hear down to just like 4 or 5 hertz, which is ridiculous. And some of them are hearing up in the hundreds of hertz. And they differ from one individual well to the next, at least with the belugas, which are the ones that have been studied the most. But the elephants, we understand the frequency range quite well. So we're definitely in the frequency range. And they even sound to us like each other. Our problem in this case was how did you get very limited time with some of these species. It's very hard to get time with elephants. This is another major issue that we're going to have working with many different species. We can't really work in zoos. I'm sure many of you have tried. I've tried as well. Yeah, and to design things that are going to work takes effort. Sorry, Ringo.
Yeah, it's also in the, the birds see in the ultraviolet. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, that's a whole nother game. Working with computer screens, what are they really seeing?
Exactly.
And, so we have to start, maybe there's some way of adapting screens so we could work that out so they can really see what things really look like.
Even with mice, even with this common laboratory animal, we're extraordinarily primitive. So not only with the senses, people didn't realize how much mice are communicating, even laboratory mice, because it's simply above our hearing. But then they're also communicating through all these other senses that we've been talking about. We have a hell of a long way to go on this. This is going to be something, I think the best thing that this team and the people listening can do is start an infrastructure so that we acknowledge the questions and think long-term about how we're going to get there, because it's going to be a major undertaking, even just to understand the senses, much less understand what's rewarding to other animals and how learning occurs. These are all essential questions that are so difficult to address. The fact that Irene and Con have done so much is really stunning, but it's also only the beginning, only a tiny fraction of what it's like to be, if you will, a gray parrot or a prairie dog. Well, I mean, Con has done incredible work, but it's only the work of the calls during relatively short sections of time when we can perceive it. There's plenty of other stuff going on.
Can I make a suggestion noting time that's going to run out? One of the common questions is how people can participate in the project. Will, I wonder if you want to comment on that.
Hi everyone. So the best way would probably to join, go to the website interspecies.io. On there you can join up to our mailing list, but you can also find a link to the Slack group.
Thank you, Will. I think given that we have probably about 8 minutes or 7 minutes, should we open this up to the Q&A?
Yes, we absolutely should.
Okay.
There's about a dozen questions that we won't be able to answer.
Right, so there are quite a few questions. People are very interested. Answering your question, Vint, about cooperation between different species, Bill writes that 2 species cooperate in nature, honey guides and honey badgers, and the bird communicates to the mammal where the location of the beehive is. So there's some information there. We began with Elizabeth that asks, are you considering including intuitive and telepathic communication between species, specifically human and non-human communication?
Well, I don't know if anybody's doing telepathics, maybe intuitive, and I'm not sure what that means either. So somebody else has to answer that.
Yeah, I think this whole area of research has been very difficult, even with humans to date. So we're kind of trying to start with things we can test empirically in ways that, again, new approaches to try to understand decoding and these interfaces. That's where our focus is going to remain right now.
Okay, so Michal is saying she has a general question regarding the project. Do you focus on animals, only on animals that are considered pets, or also on animals that humans use for their own needs, such as cows, pigs, etc.? What are your motives for choosing the animals you're researching?
Is this regarding just different people who are here, or is this for the Interspecies Internet? I'm not sure.
For the Internet project, as far as I can see.
I would answer that because this is a very inclusive group. So we have many people who are working with all different animals. We have people who are working on farm animals, exotics. It's not discriminatory about which species we're working with.
Your sound broke up for a bit, Diana, but I think the answer is that the people who are interested in this project, the several thousand who are involved, are interested in a very broad range of animals. we're not confined to the ones that we've been talking about today.
Okay, so Shani asks, can you please speak about the presence of referential understanding and aspects of open-ended communication and animal communication?
Oh, that would take another hour. Okay. But this is that we're interested in determining whether things are indexical, so that they're used only in very specific limited situations, or if they're referential in the sense that they can be expanded to look at novel instances and to be transferred to similar instances. So this is something we're all extremely interested in, but it's, it would take us another hour to even broach the subject. So many of us have papers on this. If you Google, our names, you'll see the papers that we've written on this.
And a lot of the stuff that I was talking about with prairie dogs is referential communication. And there is evidence for the formation of novel words, novel concepts that the animals have never seen before. And I do not think that prairie dogs are geniuses in the animal world and can do this. I think that all animals can do this. We just need to look.
There's also a really big literature on primate communication studies with bonobos and chimpanzees, if you're interested.
And a lot of people are actually backing off a little bit on the extent of reference. So this is a very new, it's still a new hot topic, even though we've been studying it for 50 years, literally. There's a lot of people going back and reanalyzing data and thinking things through in different ways. So it's a really exciting new topic.
Limo asks, how can social sciences and humanities take part in such a research project?
One way they could take part is two very clear things I'm hoping that somebody watching will be interested in. One is to help us with the bird plan, the bird instrument plan. So somebody who's able to maintain some zebra finches, which live to be about 3 years old, in their home. Also, anybody that's interested in working on this with wild birds, anybody that lives in the vicinity of a good wild bird population. And the other one I would ask is that if there's somebody from the social sciences or anthropology who's interested in the history of the domesticated Asian elephant, or Asian elephants altogether, to be in touch, because the ability to reconstruct this recent history with all these new elephant skills and the change from being pack animals to animals now supported by tourism has happened recently, but the people that did this are dying off, and it's time to get a devoted person who's going to study the history of that while it can still be reconstructed.
I would also add another dimension to that, that we have really talked a little bit about empathy, but there is a social science dimension to this, which is that once we establish empathy with people, with animals. For example, I'm working on a translator for dog behavior right now with Zoolingua, but people have said to me, why don't you work on a translator for sheep? Why don't you work for a translator for cows? Because once you have that, people are not going to want to eat cows, and they're not going to want to eat sheep, and they're not going to want to eat chickens. Mm-hmm. And the actual truth of the matter is that as people acquire more empathy, they become more vegan, they become more vegetarian, and that in turn has huge ramifications for the rest of the world. For example, we are destroying huge amounts of the Amazonian rainforest so that people could grow beef there and cultivate beef cattle. If people start eating veggie patties made from algae, perhaps we might not destroy so much of the Earth's habitat for raising some of these animals that consume a tremendous amount of our resources and also contribute a lot of methane gas to our atmosphere. So I think that there's a huge dimension in social science which needs to address that, because what we are doing here is literally going to change the world in terms of how people perceive animals, and also what's going to happen in terms of our eating habits, what's going to happen in terms of our habits of keeping animals. And that in turn is going to create a whole new social dimension for people to look at in terms of how that's going to happen and what the ramifications of that are going to be.
I think we're almost at our end of time, if not a minute over, but I just want to thank everybody who was participating and our audience. I think hopefully we're all together on this. Please join us in the Interspecies Internet effort. I think we're all hoping that we can have a profound effect as we share our science more globally, that it will create empathy, as we've been speaking about, and respect for other animals on this planet. We're trying to give those animals that have their own voices, whether it's vocal or behavioral, we're all communicating, it's ubiquitous. We're hoping to make that more, people more aware of that. Anyway, I just wanted to thank everybody again for joining us, and thanks for the organizers of the conference for having us.
Thank you so much, Diana, and thank you all for an exhilarating session. We will take approximately a 15-minute break. I think it's more of a 13-minute break, and rejoin for a panel on communication with sperm whales presented by the SETI project team. Please note that we will be returning to our regular Zoom link for the rest of today's sessions. Thank you.